This is a panel called Video Game Art History 102, Planes, Trains, and Chocobos. If you came to MAGFest last year, you may remember we did a video game art history program. We did 101 last year. It's going to be a little different this time around. Rather than each of us doing kind of short presentations, we're going to really focus on one topic and kind of discuss it. So if you'll bear with me, we will kind of talk through this for a little while and then jump into a discussion. In his 1997 Art Car Manifesto, the painter James Harithis wrote, quote, "Automobiles are extensions of our sense of self." He was talking about the development of the art car, a particularly 20th century mode of expression in which cars became canvases, but the art car movement wouldn't have existed if it were not for that deeply human tendency to associate ourselves with the modes of transportation that we use, to assign artistic and cultural value to consumer goods that transform our lives. And what has more potential to transform our lives than the way we get around? If you attended last year's session, you might remember that we discussed the ways that we could rethink our conception of video games, viewing them not as singular cultural objects, but rather as a current step in a long progression of visual culture. In this session, we're going to return to that idea a little bit, and we're going to talk about something very specific, that is modes of transportation, something that we encounter not only in our everyday lives, but also in the video games we play, and in the art that hangs in museums and galleries across the world. I'm here with my fellow panelists from the Smithsonian Institution. If you guys want to introduce yourselves real quick. Go for it.
Hi, I'm Ryan Linthicum. I work with Lauren over at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and together we produce the Sam Arcade event, which happens every August for 2 days.
Yeah.
I'm Justin Barber. I'm a contractor at the National Museum of American History. I work on the Lemelson Center's Video Game Pioneer Oral History Archive, and also along with assisted with the building of the Virtual Landscapes exhibit at the museum.
Hi, I'm Drew Robarge. I'm a museum specialist at the American History Museum. I work with the video game collection at the museum as well as the virtual landscape exhibit. I also do some game design at another part of the Smithsonian as well.
And I'm Lauren Glodkin. Ryan already helpfully kind of gave my resume. I also work at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I am an art historian by training. So let's jump into it. We're going to talk a little bit about how games approach ideas of transport. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. How games approach ideas of transportation, and how American history and art history can give us a little perspective on that approach. And I'm going to show you some examples to just kind of get a better sense of what we're talking about. So before we talk about planes or trains, we have to talk about horses. Our obsession with horses is as ancient as, the concept of art itself. People were drawing horses on the walls of caves, using them in elaborate mosaic floors in ancient Greece, and painting them on ancient Chinese scrolls. But why? Yes, horses are strong and they're quite astounding to look at, but you don't really see similar imagery of, say, goats. I think the closest I can compare to is maybe like buffalo or bison in Native American imagery. Even other animals that have metaphorical meanings are not nearly as predominant in artistic imagery, especially in Western art, and we are going to be talking predominantly about Western art. There is an entire subgenre of portraiture, for example, that is equestrian portraiture. You don't see a feline or canine or avian portraiture equivalent. In these two pieces, we've got Velázquez's portrait of Philip IV, and then an ancient Roman statue from about 175 AD, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. This is because horses are more than animals to us. They're implements of war, and they're modes of transportation that have transformed our capacity to live our lives. The owning of a horse, the implied ability to ride the horse, indicates wealth and status, as well as strength and dexterity. And although we no longer make these associations in popular culture, we generally only see horses in media, and video games allow us to recapture some of what horses meant to us in art. And like I said, horses are also implements of war. So you see them not only in portraiture, but also here in Surrender at Breda, also by Velázquez. And you may not think there's no horses in this. This is Washington crossing the Delaware. But I would point out, if you look at the boat right behind Washington, there are some horses, because horses come with any battle. In The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, you are able to tame horses fairly early on in gameplay. But the more impressive steeds, namely the giant horse and the Lord of the Mountain, pictured here, require a litany of skills to tame them. You are literally required to have a certain threshold of stamina in order to mount these horses. And other games even use, You're literally required to have a certain amount of stamina to mount horses, and then you're required to do certain things in order to keep them. You have to name them. In order to get them to ride well, you need to pet them, give them apples. Certain foods in the game can increase their speed, etc. So having a horse, even having a full stable of horses that you can choose from, implies your increased skill in the game. Other horses or other... Oh my gosh. Guys, it's too early. I'm so sorry. Other games use fictional creatures as stand-ins for horses, assigning them similar traits to their equestrian counterparts, namely that they're tameable, rideable, and generally timid. Chocobos, for example. In Final Fantasy XI, players could breed and raise chocobos by renting stables, introducing males and females of the species together, and crossbreeding until the player achieves the best possible chocobo in terms of speed, stamina, and racing potential. The replacement of horses and horse-drawn vehicles in our culture then allowed for the expansion of some of these ideas of the self as associated with the mode of transport. The automobile, much like the horse, required skill to operate and allowed its owner a measure of freedom and power that was previously unavailable to them. Cars could drive faster and go further, but they still required maintenance and care, and their qualities then reflected back on their owners. This is Western Motel by Edward Hopper, and you can see the nice little 1930s car in the back. Granted, we generally don't see cars in fine art portraiture the way we do with horses. It's not to say that cars didn't find their way into our visual culture through the arts. Through television, cinema, and video games are a given, but we also see them in painting, in photography, and in sculpture as well. So we see this nice piece. This is Robert McNeil, New Car, from the project The Negro in Virginia photography series. And then here are three artworks. You may recognize this piece from outside the Hirshhorn Museum on the Mall. It's a 1992 Chrysler being crushed by an ancient volcanic boulder, which is just delightful. Cars, trains, and planes have become cultural touchstones that contribute to our sense of self, but also a sense of place and time. Vehicles seem to have personalities outside of their functions, embedded in their design and the cultural moment in which they were created, or simply reached their zenith, depending on the vehicle. Cars especially have distinctive design elements and a particular materiality that give them distinctive features, which is a benefit to the consumer market, but also an important element of their importance in our culture. Airplanes and trains lack that same specific visual individuality, but any form of transit contributes to larger holistic identities and senses of place and time. For example, we've got here La Gare Saint-Lazare from 1877. This is the piece from Musée d'Orsay. Monet did a whole series of paintings in this particular train station. Obviously, when we think of Impressionists, we tend to think water lilies, but these guys were deeply affected by changes in technology and transportation that were going on in their lives, and that certainly appears in their work as well. In games like L.A. Noire, for example, you have access to your regular squad car, a Ford Police Special, but there are close to 100 cars throughout the game, all identifiable models from the 1940s, from well-known makers like Cadillac and Chrysler to the now defunct brands Delage and LaSalle, as well as special treats like the incredible Phantom Corsair. Like the clothes and the set pieces, the cars help to create the world of post-war Los Angeles, and they contribute to the character's central arc and behavior throughout the game. The sultry neo-noir setting doesn't rely on the vehicles, but they certainly evoke a sense of time and place in a very particular way, as well as contributing to the sense of the main character as a cop who has to drive to get from crime scene to crime scene. These elements that we've been talking about are particularly true in games with historical settings where you're talking about cars and trains the way we understand them. For example, in Red Dead Redemption 2, there's a focus on horses, but trains also play a big role in creating the immersive environment of the West. In fact, the dichotomy between the modes of transportation in Red Dead Redemption 2 contributes to an overwhelming sense of a world that is undergoing great changes to its technological and cultural makeup. Now, we've talked a lot about cars and trains and planes as positive things, but there's also just a sense of tension, right? So I want to look at these two pieces. With any advance in technology, the sense of anxiety that accompanies that change presents itself in our visual culture as well. Transportation happens to be a technology that is inherently connected to danger and risk, in both good and bad, just as a horse can give a portrait's sitter a sense of strength and authority. There is also an inherent understanding of the risks that riding a horse entail. For example, if you're looking at a horse in a battle scene, you recognize there was a battle beforehand, and presumably those are quite dangerous. The same is true with cars, trains, and planes. The element of danger and our mastery of that danger is never that far out of frame, nor is the tension between the past and the present embodied in technological development. In this case, the piece there on the left is by Giacomo Balla. Believe it or not, that is a picture of an automobile. It's called The Velocity of Cars and Light. Balla was obsessed with race cars, and he did a whole series of studies through 1913 and 14 about the movement, speed, and light of cars on racetracks. And then, of course, you may recognize these pieces are by Salvador Dali. Dali, unlike his fellow surrealists, was quite interested in cars, but he was interested in them as these sort of dissonant objects that were providing a kind of dissociation between the car as a functional piece, as an element of the present, and the sort of surreal landscapes and ideas of memory in the past that he was also concerned with. Video games allow us to act out these anxieties. Be it taming wild animals, driving recklessly, or flying spaceships through asteroid fields. In many ways, vehicles are both a backdrop for those plays and the stages on which they're set. An artwork cannot move through space, and we cannot enact our concerns or fantasies with it, but in a video game, we can actively choose to participate. We can steal ambulances and cop cars in Grand Theft Auto, create saddles to ride dinosaurs in Ark Survival Evolved, or go deep sea diving in Subnautica. The anxiety of the unknown and the thrill of inconsequential effect allows a player to explore some of the same ideas that artists explore when they depict new technologies and the rapid changes of the modern world. Take, for example, Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series, specifically the images of horrendous car crashes, which are rendered in bright poppy colors. Warhol wrote, "When you see a gruesome picture over and over again, it doesn't really have any effect. The concern over the increasing amount of disturbing imagery available to the average person weighed on many artists in the 20th century, especially as the Vietnam War broke out. Yet the series isn't an admonishment against the repetitive nature of news cycles. It's rather a call to empathy and a moment of recognition that these types of tragic events happen every day and are not, in fact, repetitive at all." This may seem odd, but I compare this idea to driving along Rainbow Road in Mario Kart. This bright, vibrant setting in which you can literally tumble off of the edge into oblivion or throw a banana in such a way that your friend does the nosedive instead, also asks viewers to engage in empathy and question the nature of repetition. I'd argue that Mario Kart invites us to actively play similar experiences. All the players on the track are at the mercy of bob-ombs and errant banana peels as all the other players. And our triumph in success or our disappointment in defeat is both unique to our skill set and repetitive within the bright, ageless nature of Mario's world. In short, art invites us to ask questions and glean information about a time, place, and hand by which they were made, and video games ask us to act out scenarios to achieve those same goals. So I've just given you kind of a quick, very intense rundown of what we're talking about, and now I'm going to open it up to the panelists here with me, and I'm going to ask them some questions and have them respond to some of the images and some of their own ideas and expertise about about transportation in art and video games. So we're going to start with the first question. When we look at an image of a vehicle in a work of art, we're not able to operate that vehicle. So our ability to empathize is limited. Does this change when the media is interactive? I know I'm not Link, but do I get a better sense of who Link is when I'm riding Epona?
Sure. So I think, video games, one of the great advantages of them is the fact that they do create an opportunity to empathize. You've seen a lot of this written about recently with VR coming in and how that's being used to have people empathize and dealing with their own fears and stuff like that. But I think that definitely it gives you a different perspective. Now, when you do something in an artwork where you can't control it, you're forcing the perspective. You're forcing it to see it in a specific way. One of the more interesting pieces I saw recently was at the Akron Art Museum. They actually, somebody had done a painting of a 5-star jump and Grand Theft Auto 5. So, and basically kind of taking that snapshot of that specific moment and that specific thrill to kind of show that, where, when you're driving around naturally or whatever, that might not be something you ever do. So it's kind of like forcing you to look at it in a very specific way. But I definitely think that you wouldn't get the same, you would get a very different experience by driving that same car in that same area if it was yourself making the decisions.
I also think that the thing that game gives you is agency, right? And you dictate who Link is. So you could also say that, well, I don't ride horses very well, so Link's the poor rider. But sometimes the game might want to constrain you in a way to say, like, no, actually, you are expert rider. So when you don't perform as well, you create this, little narrative dissonance where the game is telling you, the narrative telling you to do something, names tell you that you are somebody or you're doing something, but then you can't do it or you are not performing to the expectation, so it's not really kind of matching. So it kind of works both ways, whereas art, movies, and stuff like that, if somebody's driving the car expertly, he's an expert driver. There's no way, there's no contradictory information that allows you to do that. But in the games, on the other hand, if they allow you total freedom, you could circumvent narratives or you could shape the narrative in your way. So.
And then if I might chime in too, so I have a background in film studies, and so I've been thinking a lot about the differences between video games and film and art, and one of the things that scholars always say about film is that it's an empathy machine, because it plays on so many of the senses, right? We've got music, it takes you into the characters' perspectives, much in the same way that video games also do. Yes, you can argue that video games offer you more choices and thus more agency. However, you could also argue that in a video game, you are forced to play by certain rules, you are forced to become certain characters, you are forced to be in a certain world, which thus takes away a lot of your agency, much in the same way that film does as well. I had one other thought and I forgot it, but that was my main
That actually leads me to a couple of other questions. First, in many games with vehicles, especially modern vehicles, crashing is a big part of gameplay, whether it's intentional or just sort of a bonus element that's quite fun. Why are we, do you think, as Americans, so fascinated with car crashes?
I think it's, a lot of Americans do like NASCAR, and they always, for better or worse, they want to see crashes. I think it's an exciting element. I think it also plays out like a fantasy of theirs, like driving recklessly and all these kind of things you shouldn't do on the road, but in video games, your shackles are off. You can do what you want to do. You can play it out. You can, all that kind of stuff allows you to explore that side that you always want to do. Like, I think there's always this sense of independence, rule breaking that a lot of humans have, but they just know they can, they need to wield it back in, and in video games, you can do whatever you want to do, so.
Yeah, definitely. I think I mentioned the lack of consequences as an element of that fantasy, and it's something that, it's definitely present in certain artworks, but it's not omnipresent. There's an element of fantasy, especially involved in equestrian portraiture, more often than not, the person on the horse wasn't actively rearing back. Chances are, that the portrait we showed at the very top of the presentation is part of a whole series of portraits of the royal family of Spain at the time, including a portrait of the Infante Balthazar on the horse, and he must have been probably 4 or 5. There's a good chance he was not riding a giant stallion. There's definitely an element of, it's not safe to do that with a baby, but you can in a work of art, and it's okay. But it's obviously not to the same extent as it has become with video games, especially video games with cars specifically. I mean, I think again about Mario Kart, where part of the goal is to make other people crash, to blind them, to throw things on the road, etc.
I know I just had a lot of fun trying to rack up as much damage as possible with Burnout 2, where it had literally a mode where your idea was to cause as much damage as possible, and you got rewarded by the amount of damage and dollar signs that you racked up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, it also, your answers to that first question also kind of led me to another thing about cars, which is that in the Grand Theft Auto and Saints Row series, listening to the radio while driving has become a really huge element of gameplay, especially in terms of world building. I want to talk a little bit, and Ryan, you brought this up, about the association of music and driving.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about just how the senses play on when you're watching a movie or playing a video game, and how much the idea of listening to either the radio or music mostly, especially with our idea of the road, being on the road, how much that's like deeply ingrained into our culture and our society, right? Like we have these musicians, Bob Dylan, if you think about the 30s folk music and how much that has to play about your feelings of being on the road, of being in a car. Even most Western music, right? We're thinking about being on a horse, if you're thinking about being in the countryside, how deeply like Americanized that has become.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're saying in 20 years when they make a game about 2010, 2020, we'll be listening to podcasts on the radio?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
maybe. In the next Grand Theft Auto, they'll have a radio station where you can turn on NPR, and it'll just be real great. Yeah, I mean, I haven't played a Grand Theft Auto title in probably 10 years, but when I was doing research for this, I was convinced that each car had its own individual radio station. And that's how deeply I had associated the radio with the cars in the game. I just assumed, oh, well, you get in, the punch buggy and it's playing this particular station, and you get in the ambulance and it's playing that particular station. And it's just interesting that my memory of that gameplay was clouded by my own association of cars as having individual personalities and there being music associated with those individualized personalities. So I want to go back a little bit into talking about horses. Horses appear in a number of fantasy games, especially, I'm thinking of things like, Skyrim, Legend of Zelda, I'm sure there's many more and I'm blanking now. But I'm wondering why do you guys think that a game designer or games would utilize horses as opposed to more fantastical creatures like Chocobos, for example, or even Yoshi, for example?
Well, the horse has a motion that's very well studied. It's not necessarily animated the best, but it's well studied. So when you're coming up with a different creature, you have to think, okay, how this, creature going to move? How does it make sense? You're going to have to create this whole world for this new creature. Where a horse, like you already have, what the horse will provide you, and it fits your needs. Basically, I think a lot of ways that you can focus your energy and time on other stuff and. You don't need to create a whole new creature when you have so much other stuff you have to worry about, and so.
Yeah. It's just like with games like Skyrim that have such elaborate world building, And there are certainly, there are dragons in Skyrim, so it's not like they're not building out these fantastical creatures. I just wonder if maybe the horse has so much embedded meaning to us in Western culture that it's not only easier, as you said, from a development perspective, it also already fills in a lot of these, sort of world building gaps about how people get around and how people treat animals and how animals are viewed and sort of engaged with.
Well, and I might add too, if you want to go back to the Red Dead Redemption slide, like when you look at a picture of a man sitting on a horse, you're immediately like thinking about, well, at least this is what I think about, is like manifest destiny. You're thinking about manliness. You're thinking about particularly probably white male manliness, and that is. The outback, the cowboy, and the taking that symbol and bringing it into Legend of Zelda, something other that's fantastical. You have something to compare it to in our collective memory.
Yeah. I'm going to jump onto another question, sort of vaguely related, which is, why do so many games let us ride dinosaurs, and why don't more games let us ride dinosaurs?
Have you seen the dinosaurs in the natural history?
I have. I'd like to ride them. They look great.
They're giant.
Yeah, sounds awesome.
They're different, yeah.
It's about enacting fantasies. We talked about this. You guys saw these questions in advance, so.
If I might just piggyback on my own comment too about, I'm thinking about Jurassic Park. I think a lot about movies, so I think about Jurassic Park, right? And I think about the interactions between humans and dinosaurs, right? And like just the even idea of taking a beast like a horse that's already muscular, masculine, and bringing that into a ginormous dinosaur, right? Like, and being able to like master this dinosaur that is ancient and huge and ferocious, that it's so I'm trying to think of a better word besides masculine, but it's like it's empowering, right? And I don't play many video games, but I'm assuming female characters can also ride dinosaurs in some games. And that's also a form of power, but just it also just kind of brings it even like 5 steps more into this idea of dominance and power. And
well, going back to, I think the point of my comment is about scaling, right? So the game that I'm working on is actually about the ocean, and we deal with plankton, which you actually can't see, but they're so fundamental to ocean life. So we had discussion is how do we realistically show plankton when, you can see coral, but you really can't see plankton. So to show specks of clouds and stuff like that would do it, but not real either. So so we actually started where you start in a microscopic level so you can see the plankton, and then we zoom you out. So we had to create a little bit of fancy element to show like, okay, you're in a microscopic level. So the same thing with dinosaurs. There's huge, there's scale. Like if you really want to be realistic to scale, like the dinosaurs would, it would be just unrealistic at all different levels. So whereas, of course, many games break scale, and that's okay. But I think if you're, depending on your game designer's needs, you would probably want to try to stay true. And the horses offers equivalent scale, that it's realistic in a lot of ways, and so you don't have to worry about that from a game design perspective.
Yeah. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. First, I want to talk a little bit less about dinosaurs, but about past. Video games allow us to not only enact out our own fantasies, but imagine how our ancestors might have traveled and how our descendants might travel. How does the speculative nature of technology in video games contribute to our understanding of our own culture? And what would it look like if we applied that reasoning to games from the 1970s and 80s? Drew, I know that you had some responses to this, so I'm not letting you off the
hook. There's a famous saying, the past is a foreign country. So a lot of times when we do find ourselves imagining and how our ancestors traveled and how that might be, we are speculating. I can play Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag and imagine that's what it's like sailing in the Caribbean minus all of the scurvy and, disease But yeah, at the same time, I think that when we get into that speculative nature, we have to also be very careful, because this is a very visceral experience that a lot of people will come to associate as being part of this is how it is. So making that very clear is important. It would be interesting to see, talking about applying these types of things to the 70s and 80s, although that's a very different position in the sense that we do have people who are still alive who experienced that. So they can really give us a better idea of whether it hits the mark or not, as opposed to something much further back. But yeah, so that's where my head is on it.
Yeah.
Well, when we went home, my grandmother was telling a story about she was moving from Seattle to Connecticut, and that's a long drive, with 4 kids and everything. So I was asking her, like, how long did it take? Because today, we have better fuel mileage, we have much more support on the roads. Highways are higher speed right now. Back then, the speed limit was 55, even on the major highways, and then that changed, and now states have their own dynamics. And she had 4 kids, so I asked her how long she took, and she could remember. And even if what answer she gave me might be clouded by what she experienced nowadays and stuff like that. So. And that's the thing we bring to our, as we're playing a game like that's set in the 1880s. Like, we're still bringing our biases, our experiences to the game. So it might help, shape it. But like, I still think that I think your point, like, we'll never get to that point. I think it might be super difficult to do. So. And
just to kind of follow up on what you were saying too, when it comes to going cross country. This is where, back in the going to like the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of roadside attractions, which you don't find anymore. And it has a lot to do with the fact that road mileage is improved and so forth. These were things that you did along the way because it was a much larger. So that's a whole other aspect of America that has kind of dissipated and is much more limited now than it used to be. Seeing the mermaid on the side of the road. So.
Very much so. I think I was thinking about this question more in the sense that, we are, like, for example, I think of Subnautica and these, sort of buildable, modular submarines that he's able to just sort of construct, or I made the character male, but you don't actually know. That the main character is able to construct, and imagining in playing that game is, what will the world look like if and when this technology is available? And, what element of my understanding of the world, will have to fundamentally change when that is true? And then thinking back to, even just Space War, the very first video game, when these guys were creating this game, were they imagining a world in which at some point...
Can you hit B?
What?
Hit B on your laptop.
Oh.
Lost you.
There you go.
There you go. We're good. Sorry. We're imagining a world in which, there was space flight to that extent, that you could have multiple craft up there flying around. I'm sort of thinking of it in those terms, and video games sort of as an exercise in imagining what the future might look like. So I think we'll do one last bigger question and then kind of open it up to audience questions. Art and video games use transportation as a metaphor for the American experience. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about other forms of media that tackle that same metaphor and use planes, trains, and automobiles and or chocobos in a similar way.
Well, thank you, Lauren, for that great question. I have some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, thank you. Is it obvious that she wrote it?
Yes, I did. So, as I stated before, too, I have more of a background in film history. And so when Lauren and I were talking a lot about this panel, it got me thinking a lot about the road movie. Road movie, for example, you think about Easy Rider, 1969. You think about Mad Max, original and present. Thelma and Louise. You think about Motorcycle Diaries, 2004, Little Miss Sunshine, 2006. I could go on and on and on. But some of our favorite movies, American movies, take place on the road. And as we talked about a little bit before, The idea of a road movie or a road story that takes place in some mode of transportation, either a horse or a train, but mostly cars, is distinctly Americanized. Here, it's not just a plot device in a lot of films or even in video games, but it's also can be a character in and of itself. Just thinking of the van from Little Miss Sunshine, like how iconic that is. But it's also, a way of describing and moving the plot forward by describing the characters, having it as an accessory, having the characters move from either escaping something or moving towards something else. Thelma and Louise is just one of my favorite movies because not only do we kind of break gender barriers in this film, but they're also like iconicizing the idea of traveling across the country as two women. And here it's also a really interesting parallel because you have other media where there's a lot of similarities between video games and movies. One of which, if I think about, is Grand Theft Auto, right? Which we've talked about a little bit before. But Grand Theft Auto takes so much of its theme and iconicism from Taxi Driver, 1976. Scorsese said himself that he really liked the video game because it had so many parallels. But in the film, the film's premise, right? It's about a psychopath who drives around a big city, thinks all citizens and politicians are filth, and gets involved in a bloody shootout. So it's like, of course, that's the video game. And in fact, doing some research for this, I found out that the original 1997 2D game offered a choice of a Mohawk sporting character named Travis. So parallels there. And then Taxi Driver 2, to add, it was a huge road movie that made a huge impact on American culture, right? And in a post-Vietnam era where masculinity is questioned, especially white male masculinity is questioned, it became so deeply ingrained that we still think about this idea today when we play the video game. Also, just other movies too, thinking about John Ford's 1956 The Searchers, which also was influenced by books, The Virginian, 1902, by Owen Whistler, which is considered the first Western. Grapes of Wrath, you can think about On the Road, Jack Kerouac. Other types of media too, we were talking a lot about art, but one California Museum of Photography in 2000 did a show called Rear View Mirror, American Roadways and Identities. And then lastly, we have road movies based on video games, which Mad Max is a video game where 60% of the game is driving. And it's, even though they didn't want to do a tie-in to the movie, because the players didn't want to be able to play the movie game. But obviously that's also another road type of film. But, you could go on and on, Star Wars, Tron, Back to the Future, Pirates of the Caribbean, etc. So those are just some of my thoughts. I'm gonna keep going.
Yeah.
If you guys wanted to jump off of all of that.
Yeah.
How do we follow up that?
Yeah.
I know. Wow. Damn. Sorry.
But, well, there's some games that does a lot of that driving to central element, as well as some are real and some are farcical, Desert Bus. Obviously, you drive literally for 8 hours straight, and you get 1 point when you finish, and you drive back. And so it was meant to be again, showing a little bit the comedy and of making a game about just driving on a lonely stretch of road. But then people have taken that to make a charity drive-a-thon. People take turns driving the bus as long as they can, back and forth. And then there's also recent games like Final Fantasy 15, where driving is very much a part is set in old Western. You go to a gas station and all that kind of stuff. So there is some other games that have that road motif. So.
Yeah, well, and certainly music is as well. We briefly touched on music as an element of automobiles and forms of transportation having personality, but also music in and of itself often touches on these ideas. I think of, Tracy Chapman or, songs where cars are an element, the idea of, driving. There's a John Mayer song I feel like I listened to a lot as a teenager about driving. Again, it's something that you could just create an exhaustive list, which really, I think, lends itself to our point, which is that the way we move through the world is a big part of what makes us us, especially as Americans.
Well, I think it was interesting you mentioned about teenager. Driving is like a major milestone for teenagers, right? So in video games, you can actually drive.
Yeah.
And whereas you don't actually drive until you're 16 or more. So adult, maybe you don't get the drill, but when you're younger, I can drive, and it doesn't really matter. So I think there's also like a age element to what we're talking about too.
Enacting fantasies, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think with that, let's open it up. Does anyone in the audience have any questions or anything they want to continue to discuss? Yeah, bangs. Sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses. Yeah.
And I wanted to mention one that I thought was interesting. Mass Effect 1 had this thing called the Mako. It was horrible. It was terrible to drive. You couldn't figure out what direction it was going at any point in time. But NASA's new Mars rover transportation vehicle looks exactly like the Mako.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example of, I think, what we were getting at, which is that, the only limit, I mean, beyond the box, I suppose, the limit of a video game is the designer's imagination and the amount of time and money they have to put into it. So there is an element of being able to explore these ideas. I think of, did anyone in the room watch Carboys, the Polygon series Carboys? Yeah, it's hysterically funny. But I also just think of, the two journalists doing that series playing with these vehicles, some of which are, pretty typical, fake versions of cars, and then there's a train and there's an airplane and they can't make them fly and yada yada. But then they have that strange little orb that sort of hovers around. It's like, who thought of that? And is there going to be a vehicle someday that's like that? And good God, is it going to make me as nauseous as this video is making me? Because Holy Mother of God. But yeah, I mean, I think you just touched on exactly what we were getting at.
Well, I would also say that, we discuss a lot about cars, but public transportation is often not featured, or it's featured in ways that more like fast travel, so we can design a future, but it's still, the game's trying to give you agency, and the best way to do that is through cars or individual vehicles, whereas I think the world wants to move towards like public transportation, consolidated, and games, maybe not the best medium to allow for that, because unless you want to spend time riding in a subway or in a, whatever, Hyperloop or
Although
so.
MMOs certainly have that. I mean, World of Warcraft has a train system, and it's a fast travel system more or less, but like you do have to wait to a particular time to get on that form of transit. So it's not that it's unexplored in games, but rather, you're right, it's not you don't have as much agency. And yeah, if it's just you playing, Grand Theft Auto, you don't want to sit there and wait for the bus on the street in Miami. That would maybe not be as fun as just going and stealing a car. There was a question in the far back. Yeah.
You had a question earlier was asking, why developers would go with horses as opposed to fantastic creatures. Did you touch on it at all, like why you go the opposite way? Why go with chocobos or
No,
but other things? Why do that as a storytelling technique?
I mean, I think that's a really great question. Again, I think it goes back to this thing we've been talking about, which is, enacting fantasies and world building and your mode of transportation as a means of expressing your own identity, but also really filling in the world around you. For example, like LA Noire isn't reliant on the cars, but the game doesn't all fully work without them. And they could have, again, done all the same car or whatever, but having these very distinct, recognizable modes of transport certainly really, they contribute to your immersion in Los Angeles in the 1940s. Whereas I think in a game like, say, Ark, where you have dinosaurs, but they're scaled in such a way that you can ride them, it contributes more to the immersive sense of you being on this island, trying to survive, trying to engage with these creatures around you, kind of trying really to put yourself in the shoes of the protagonist to a certain extent.
Well, and if I may too, I was thinking about the what are they called?
Chocobos.
Chocobos, sorry. They even though they're fantastical, right, they still draw on creatures that exist in real life. Thinking about mythological creatures too that are hybrids of various different animals. But then that also speaks to your character and your world, right? You're taking the structure of a horse, but you're putting feathers on it. I mean, you have the softness, but then you also have the muscular strength of a horse or a beast. That also instills like an idea of power. The combination of those can create something brand new, but it's something that also we as a culture, as a society, already know about.
Well, I think of the Lord of the Mountain too. I mean, we recognize that is horse-like, but it's got two faces on it. I don't know about you guys, but I was looking at my Switch like, what am I looking at? You know, it's very strange. But there is an element of using a structure we're familiar with to build something fantastical around it.
You want to say something?
No.
Okay. Well, I also think the other thing is that a lot of fantasy is borrowed from Lord of the Rings, and they had a horse kingdom, basically, the harem in there, and then Dungeons and Dragons inspired by it and all that kind of stuff. So I think the fantasy structure allows for horses, but if you want to break from Lord of the Rings, I think in a way you might need to move away from horses and think of other modes of transportation. So that's the other thing that just came to me, like, it's already had this set like framework that allows you, like, okay, it doesn't seem rare to have like a horse in Skyrim because it's coming from Lord of the Rings, so that's the lineage it's coming from. But if you're doing Final Fantasy where you're trying to like say, this is my own world, this is my own framework, then I think you need to get away from horses. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think our concept of attachment to different forms of transportation may also be connected to just that more time you spend with something or even someone, you just get more closer and more attached to it.
Yeah.
Basically, at the same time, if you're like going to a certain place that you really need to, or you're like probably very close to like an amusement park, and you have like a lot of feelings towards that amusement parks or something, that may also be another factor, basically, why you're like attached to the thing that help you breathe something that you really like.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I was also thinking about, there's the idea of fantasy, right? We've got Lord of the Rings, and I was also thinking about like futuristic fantasy space, right? And how I love Star Trek and Star Wars, and thinking about those modes of transportation and thinking like how idyllic it is, and like that also has like an emotional component to it, because it's like that's what I aim for, is what I always want to like happen in the future. Like, not that I'll ever be alive to see that, but that also has like childhood memories associated with it too. So it's an interesting point.
And we weirdly, I do think we have a tendency in Western culture to assign personality to things, to consumer goods, especially major ones, things that are big investments, because we are going to be with them for a long time. My grandfather, his whole life, named his cars, but he always gave them the same name. Each car didn't have an individual name, but the car was always this name. And it was this long-running joke, but also this kind of moment of empathy with the vehicle. She's with me all the time. She takes me where I need to go. I take care of her. I feed her. I take her to the doctor when she's sick, etc. And I think that's not an experience in a vacuum. I think a lot of people do things like that. Whether or not they name their cars is, to be determined. But I think people do think of their cars. People say, "Oh, this is my new baby," or, my car is broken down. Like, we don't think of them the same way we think of like shoes, for example. If your shoe gets a hole in it, you replace it, right? If your car has a leak or something's wrong, you take it and you go get it fixed.
I was going to say, no, sorry to interrupt you, but I was thinking, like, not that we have any time to get into this, but if we were in, that just goes right back into like a gender topic too, because all of our mechanics, our sailing ships, our spaceships are all women.
Women, yeah.
Unless anyone have a car that they named after a man.
I did. My car was named, what was my car named? I don't know, but I did have a car, and it was named after a guy. And that's all you need to know about me. Thank you. Any other questions before we finish up?
I would just say, as far as like naming and stuff like that, I don't know where it originated, whether it was civilians versus military, I know back in the day, military, a lot of them named their planes, their helicopters, their tanks. A lot of them did female, but like my unit, our helicopters, we had never had female named for different aircraft.
Yeah.
Who the crew chief wasn't what they chose to, name their aircraft, but there was those that, to us, like, we kind of like, yeah, like you said, we imparted our emotions upon them. We felt this is our girl, this is our guy that's going to bring us home safe, we're going to take care of her, so
Right.
we can get home, we'll bring people home.
And she protects you, so they protect you. I mean, that's part of it too. There is an inherent risk when you drive, when you fly an airplane or a helicopter, that you understand inherently that you're taking when you embark on that journey. And it's not just, you operating the vehicle properly, it's external factors as well. And there is an element of, comfort in knowing that you care about your vehicle and hopefully your vehicle cares about you too. And that's certainly true of horses as well. I mean, there's an element of, we think of horses and we think of loyalty, right? We think of, the horse riding with its master into battle and being there with him or whatever. It's when we see horses die in film and TV, it bothers us, right? We name them, they're like pets, even though they're not pets, right? So there is that weird, we are unable, I think, really to look at big things like that we put our faith in our lives into and not give them some element of ourselves.
We felt horrible about releasing the aircraft behind because they
Yeah.
shot down.
Yeah,
Well, and then,
We were covered, but the aircraft had destroyed them.
right?
Yeah.
It feels bad. I mean, I feel bad. My father sold my car the day after I left to go to college, and I cried. I was angry.
well,
That-
and then
that
like
car's
one other
terrible.
example I was thinking of too, and then I'm going to get to you,
Yeah.
is that in the movie Alien, do you see Alien? Yeah, their ship is called Mother, which is so strange, but it's a whole other thing. But you had a question or comment?
Yeah, go for it.
I call my car Viper.
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 That's a good one.
Very
I like
gender
that.
neutral too.
Yeah, I'm a fan of that.
Yeah.
It's like sexy but gender neutral, but there's a lot going on there. Do we have any other questions before we wrap it up? Anybody? Yeah, go for it in the back.
What are your thoughts on maybe games that don't use vehicles as transportation? I think like Twisted Metal or Vigilante 8, where the vehicles are, like you're not using them to go anywhere, but it's just, they're more a weapon or even an extension of just, they are the character.
Yeah. I feel like I haven't heard from Drew or Justin in a while. Do you guys want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I was speaking earlier this morning about, post-apocalyptic, a major site is the wrecked car. Like you're walking around it, it's in your way, it's barriers. It actually becomes more of a barrier than actually freedom, like all of a sudden, like, oh, I have to climb over it, or they use it strategically to say, like, you can't go there, like, or there's a community over there. So, so I think that, that's another way of looking at it, like, past this car usage, now it's a barrier and not a access point, so.
Or I think, not to jump on your film toes, but I think of like Snowpiercer, for example, the comic book and the movie, where the train, the mode of transportation is not only the setting, but it's the thing they're sort of fighting against, is moving through the train. And it's not a weapon, for example, as you're suggesting, it's sort of in between what Drew mentioned and what you asked about, which is the vehicle becoming the obstacle instead of the extension of the self. But I think that is such a powerful metaphor to us because of our tendency to associate our modes of transportation with ourselves. It really is powerful to then think about fighting against it. And it's terrifying. I think of something post-apocalyptic, of cars being stuck in the road in a forever traffic jam, and it kind of gives me the jimmies a little bit.
Well, and then also it talks about systems, right? So when the post-apocalyptic happens, you summies, cars might be functional, but you need gas, and it's not who's making the gas, who is, how you're gonna pump the gas, and all of a sudden things break down, and system breaks down, like everything and so it's a little bit like, it's perfectly fine, but you just can't do anything to get it to run, so.
And transportation is so inherently a part of the system in which we live that to have it transformed into an obstacle or a weapon or something that rather than protecting us can actually harm us or endanger us, I think is really, I think quite visceral to think about, for sure. Does that answer your question? Yeah, sorry. We can talk more, but I don't want to keep you guys much longer because it's coming around to 11. So thank you guys so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your panels today.